If you think the Sith were wrong, I agree. But if you think the Jedi were right, you haven't been paying attention. The Jedi are actually worse. Not equally bad, worse. Because the Sith never claimed to be saving you. The Jedi did. They built an institution, wrote a code, recruited children, and called it enlightenment. Then they watched that institution produce broken people for thousands of years and kept insisting the code was fine. Here's the evidence. Go back to the original Jedi Code. Not the one Obi-Wan quotes, not the one on the temple walls. The original formulation, the one that existed before Jedi Master Odan-Urr revised it roughly 5,000 years before the Empire rose. That code read, emotion yet peace, ignorance yet knowledge, passion yet serenity, chaos yet harmony, death yet the Force. 2 words, yet. The ancient code acknowledged that emotion exists, that passion exists, and pointed towards something beyond them without pretending they weren't real. It was a developmental model. Here is where you are, here is where you are going, and the journey between them is the point. The ancient Jedi practitioner was being trained to work through emotion toward peace, to experience passion and develop towards serenity. The tension between those states was the practice. Odan-Urr changed it. His motivation was the perceived danger of the dark side, which is understandable, watching Force users get consumed by rage and fear, concluding that the solution is to cut the fuel line entirely. The revised code replaced every yet with there is no. The new formulation? There is no emotion, there is peace. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge. There is no passion, there is serenity. There is no chaos, there is harmony. There is no death, there is the Force. 5,000 years of Jedi history ran on that revision. One structural word changed the entire operating principle of the Order. Read the 2 codes side by side, and the architectural difference is immediate. The original describes a practitioner who develops toward peace through the full range of their inner life. Odan-Urr's version describes a practitioner from whom emotion has been excised. There is no emotion isn't a destination you arrive at through practice. It's an instruction to pretend, and 5,000 years of training Jedi to pretend, to label their feelings as dangerous, to suppress rather than process, to call the suppression peace, produced exactly the outcomes you'd expect from that instruction. The Order then codified this into institutional policy. No attachment, no romantic bonds, no marriage. Children were taken from their families young enough that the Order itself became the only relational anchor they'd ever known. And then they were told not to get attached to that either. The official rationale had a certain logic. Attachment leads to possessiveness, possessiveness to fear of loss to the dark side. Trace the thread from love to Palpatine's throne, and the steps hold together. The error isn't in the reasoning. The error is in the conclusion. The Order decided the answer to possessive attachment was the removal of all attachment, rather than the cultivation of love that doesn't depend on possession. Those are completely different prescriptions. The Order only ever taught one of them. Anakin Skywalker is the case study every Star Wars fan knows, and the one the Order kept refusing to learn from. He arrived already attached, 9 years old, a mother he adored, bonds already formed before any Jedi training had begun. By the Council's own standards, too old to begin. Qui-Gon Jinn pushed through the exception because he believed Anakin was the chosen one, and the Council accepted him as exactly that, an exception, in a system with no room for exceptions and no mechanism to handle them. The training Anakin received told him what he already felt was a liability. His love for Shmi wasn't acknowledged, processed, integrated into some framework for what it means to be a Jedi who loves someone. It was treated as a risk, something to be managed, minimized, overcome. Obi-Wan Kenobi was a good man, skillful, dedicated, genuinely fond of Anakin. And he failed him almost entirely on this axis, not through cruelty, but through compliance. Obi-Wan was exactly what the Order produced when it worked. a Jedi who had successfully internalized the Code's parameters and couldn't imagine operating outside them. He had nothing to offer Anakin that the Code didn't already supply, and the Code supplied no vocabulary for what Anakin actually needed. When Anakin began having visions of Padme dying, the Order's prescribed response was the same it had always been. Release your attachment. The fear you feel is the path to the dark side. The solution is to stop feeling it. Even Yoda, on whom the full weight of Jedi wisdom was supposed to rest, told Anakin to be mindful of his feelings and to let go of everything he feared to lose. That advice is useless, not because Anakin was uniquely weak, but because it was useless advice, delivered by an institution to a person in genuine crisis. It didn't address the cause of his fear. It asked him to feel less. Palpatine offered something concrete, a way to act on the fear, to prevent the loss rather than accept it. And Palpatine was the only one in the room with a practical offer. The Jedi don't create these outcomes incidentally. The structure creates them. Tell someone their emotions are dangerous, deny them any outlet, provide no guidance on integration, forbid them from even naming what they feel, and you have assembled the conditions for exactly the kind of collapse the Code claimed to prevent. Every Jedi who fell to the dark side became, in the Order's framework, evidence of individual weakness rather than institutional failure. Each fall was a personal tragedy. The Code was never questioned. The patients were defective. The Sith Code runs, "Peace is a lie. There is only passion. Through passion, I gain strength. Through strength, I gain power. Through power, I gain victory. Through victory, my chains are broken. The Force shall free me." Set aside what the Sith do with this and read it as a diagnostic document. Peace is a lie, meaning the Jedi's claim serenity is a performance, not a genuine state, and that the emotional reality Odan-Urr's Code denies is still operative beneath the surface. Accurate. There is only passion, meaning the emotional life the revised Code instructs Jedi to erase is, in fact, ineradicable. Also accurate. The Sith correctly identified that the Jedi are suppressing something real, that the suppression itself is the institutional lie, and that the underlying reality of emotion and passion won't disappear because a piece of philosophy asserts there is no emotion. The first clause of the Sith Code is a sound philosophical critique of the Jedi Order. The next 4 lines are where the Code destroys itself. Through passion I gain strength. Through strength I gain power. Through power I gain victory. The logical leap here is enormous, and it almost never gets the attention it deserves. The Sith correctly diagnose that suppression is destructive. Their prescribed cure is the weaponization of everything the Jedi suppressed. Don't suppress your passion, fuel your ambition with it. Don't suppress your rage, use it as propellant. The philosophy that begins with, emotion is real and important, arrives at, therefore, dominate everyone around you. That step is asserted, not argued. It's an addiction model. Each stage intensifies the previous one. Passion yields strength. Strength demands more power. Power requires victory. Victory requires more victory. The chain breaking the final line promises never actually arrives, because every victory creates the conditions requiring the next one. A Sith Lord in full control of a planet needs the sector, then the system, then the quadrant. There is no saturation point. The philosophy of endless acquisition has no terminal state except total domination, which the Sith collectively proved incapable of maintaining, or collapse into the precise condition they were using dominance to escape. The Brotherhood of Darkness is what that collapse looks like when applied at full organizational scale. By the time Darth Bane encountered it, the Brotherhood was a collective of Sith Lords operating under Lord Khan, built on the premise that distributed Sith strength could overwhelm the Jedi. The theory was reasonable. The execution was structurally impossible. Every tenet of the Sith Code orients toward individual supremacy, through my passion, my strength, my power, my victory. The first-person singular is load-bearing. When you assemble people trained on that philosophy into a cooperative organization, you have built a machine whose ideology is structurally opposed to its own stated mission. Internal power struggles among the Brotherhood weren't a deviation from how Sith philosophy operated. They were its inevitable output applied to collective governance. Lord Khan's resolution was the thought bomb at Ruusan, a force weapon that destroyed both the Brotherhood and much of the Army of Light simultaneously. The Sith defeated the Jedi and themselves in the same explosion. Darth Bane survived because he hadn't been present at the detonation. He'd seen it coming. More than that, he understood precisely why it was coming, had tried to make others understand, and failed. What he did next repays careful attention, because he wasn't simply the next Sith Lord in the succession. He was a structural critic of his own ideology. Drew Karpyshyn's Darth Bane trilogy, 3 novels, Path of Destruction, Rule of Two, and Dynasty of Evil, documents what Bane understood and what he did about it. He had done the diagnostic work the Brotherhood refused to do, and his response wasn't to change the underlying philosophy, but to engineer around its worst self-destructive tendencies. The Rule of Two, one master to embody the full power of the Sith, one apprentice to crave it. Never more. The master trains the apprentice completely, withholding nothing, because the goal is to eventually produce a Sith Lord stronger than the one who trained them. The apprentice grows until capable of challenging and killing the master. The surviving member becomes the new master and takes a new apprentice. Every generation, the Sith power concentrates rather than dilutes. Over a millennium, producing a single practitioner of almost incomprehensible capability, rather than a collection of mediocre lords fighting over resources. The engineering is elegant. It's also still a murder treadmill. Every master-apprentice relationship under the Rule of Two is a contained version of exactly what destroyed the Brotherhood. 2 people who will eventually try to kill each other, because the system structurally requires it. The master must remain vigilant against the apprentice growing too strong too soon. The apprentice must watch for the moment the master becomes vulnerable. Bane knew this. He lived it. The Dynasty of Evil novel has him actively guarding against allowing his own order to fall into the same patterns as the Brotherhood, meaning he built his system with perfect clarity about what it demanded from everyone inside it, and built it anyway. This is the essential difference between Jedi failure and Sith failure. The Jedi created a broken system through misguided idealism, through the genuine conviction that suppression was serenity, held by people who had no malicious intent. Bane created a broken system through perfectly accurate self-knowledge. He saw what Sith philosophy does to people, what it did to the Brotherhood, what it would do to every master-apprentice pair in his lineage, and the best solution he could design was a more efficient version of the same failure. He was brilliant. He was thorough. He couldn't engineer away the premise of his own ideology, because you either change the premise or you live with its consequences, and he never changed the premise. The answer to both failures had already existed for 36,000 years before either order formalized their particular variety of getting it wrong. On the planet Tython, in the deep core, the Jedi Order founded itself on a premise that sounds almost too simple to have been abandoned. The Force has 2 aspects, light and dark, and functional existence requires holding both. This wasn't philosophical preference for the Jedi. Tython enforced it physically. The planet was hospitable only when its Force users maintained genuine equilibrium between the Ashla, the light aspect, and the Bogan, the dark. Tip the collective too far toward the light, and Tython destabilized. Tip it toward the dark, and the same result. The planet functioned as a continuous physical feedback mechanism. Balance wasn't an ideal on Tython. It was a survival requirement the world itself imposed, measurable in weather patterns and geological stability. The Jedi didn't suppress the dark aspect. They studied it. Practitioners who fell too far toward darkness were sent to meditate on Bogan's moon until they returned to equilibrium. Practitioners who fell too far toward the light were sent to the other. The point wasn't to maintain permanent residence on one side. It was to stay centered, drawing consciously from both, aware of each. That balance philosophy survived into the ancient Jedi formulation. Emotion, yet peace. Passion, yet serenity. The word yet was doing real philosophical work. It described a dynamic tension, not a static state. The Force Wars on Tython split the Jedi. Those who chose the light side became the founding members of what would eventually become the Jedi Order. The original balance philosophy, the framework that had governed Force use for millennia before the Jedi had a name, was abandoned in favor of light side exclusivity. The foundational insight that you can't have the Ashla without the Bogan, that denying one destabilizes everything, was set aside. Odan-Urr's revision, made roughly 5,000 years before the Empire, wasn't the birth of the problem. It was the completion of an abandonment that had begun at Tython's Force Wars, the moment the Jedi split, and the survivors encoded half their framework as the whole framework. The original answer didn't disappear. It kept being rediscovered by practitioners who thought hard enough about why the Jedi framework kept producing the outcomes it kept producing, usually at significant personal cost. Jolee Bindo thought hard enough. He lost 20 years in a jungle for it. He was a trained Force user who had served the Jedi Order, married a woman named Nyama in direct violation of the Code's prohibition on attachment, and watched his wife turn to the dark side. The Code's instruction in that situation was unambiguous. She was dangerous, and dangerous Force users get dealt with. Jolee spared her instead. He couldn't kill his wife, and he didn't. The Jedi Council held him partially responsible for her subsequent actions. Rather than accept that judgment, he refused the rank of Jedi Knight and went into self-imposed exile in the Shadowlands of Kashyyyk, the deep, largely impenetrable lower levels of a Wookiee planet, where even Wookiees didn't venture comfortably, and stayed for approximately 20 years. Alone, by choice, because the alternative was membership in an institution that had no framework for what he'd actually learned. What he'd learned, stated directly in Knights of the Old Republic, was, love doesn't lead to the dark side. Passion can lead to rage and fear, and can be controlled, but passion isn't the same thing as love. That single line performs more philosophical work than the entire revised Jedi Code managed in 5,000 years of application. The Code's prohibition on attachment treats love and possessive passion as equivalent. Both involve emotional investment, and the Code's framework for emotional investment is, essentially, don't. Jolee's formulation makes the distinction the Code refused to make. Passion and love are different things. Fear of loss and love are different things. And conflating them produces a prohibition on the wrong thing entirely. What Anakin needed to be taught was that love without possessiveness was possible, that you could care for someone without making their survival the condition of your own stability. The Code, lacking any vocabulary for this distinction, could only say, don't love. That instruction was technically wrong, practically catastrophic, and Jolee had lived through both sides of the proof. His advice on the matter? A life without risk is boring. Is that how you want to live? You want love, you've got to fight for it. Coming from a man who had spent 2 decades in Kashyyyk's Shadowlands, rather than let the Council tell him his love was a liability, he emerged from those 20 years with a dry, unhurried humor, strong ethical convictions. He was completely clear that Malak was a tyrant who needed to be stopped, that moral neutrality was its own kind of failure, and total independence from both the Jedi Order and the gravitational pull of the dark side. The Order had no category for him, Jedi or fallen, light side or dark, compliant or dangerous. Jolee occupied none of these cleanly. He had left the Order, refused its judgment, lived entirely outside its structures for 2 decades, and emerged more ethically coherent and philosophically grounded than most of its active members. The taxonomy's failure to account for him says more about the taxonomy than it does about Jolee Bindo. Revan refused the taxonomy at larger scale. He was a Jedi Knight who concluded, when the Mandalorian invaders were burning through the Outer Rim and the Jedi Council refused to engage, that the galaxy needed defending regardless of institutional approval. He led a faction of Jedi to war against Council orders. He fell to the dark side during the campaign, became Darth Revan, built his own Sith empire, and was eventually captured by the Jedi Council, who wiped his memory and rebuilt him as a soldier with no knowledge of who he'd been. He rediscovered his own identity anyway, reconstructed himself from the pieces, and ultimately moved back toward the light, not because the Jedi welcomed him gracefully, but because his own investigation of his past led him there. His arc demonstrates, at the level of lived experience rather than doctrine, what the gray synthesis actually is. He understood both frameworks from the inside, not theoretically, not through scholarly study, but as a practitioner who had operated at the functional extreme of each. He had been a Jedi operating by the Code's parameters and found them insufficient when the galaxy required action. He had been a Sith Lord and survived the ideology's demands long enough to understand what they produced. His return to the light wasn't a return to Jedi orthodoxy. It was something assembled from the full experience, carrying the costs of both traditions alongside the understanding of what each actually delivered. The gray synthesis tends to remain abstract when discussed philosophically. Revan's arc makes it concrete. Someone who has been both things, who simultaneously carries the knowledge of what both failures look like, is in a position to build something neither tradition managed by itself. Qui-Gon Jinn never identified himself as gray, and never described himself as anything other than a committed practitioner of the light side. But his philosophical relationship to the Force differed from the Order's mainstream in ways that put him at chronic, low-grade conflict with the Jedi Council throughout his career. The mainstream Jedi tradition operated through the unifying Force, the Force as a cosmic will operating across time, a long arc the Jedi served by reading the future and positioning themselves within it. Qui-Gon practiced the living Force, which is present tense rather than long range. He trusted intuition over calculation. He attended to the specific creature or situation in front of him, rather than processing it through the lens of what it meant for the grand cosmic plan. He moved with the current, rather than trying to read where the river would be a decade downstream. This produced a practitioner who made decisions that looked unconventional from outside, recruiting a 9-year-old miner son from Tatooine against explicit council misgivings, insisting Anakin was the chosen one when every council member had reservations, operating on instinct rather than consensus. These weren't departures from wisdom, they were the output of a different epistemology. The council processed the Force through accumulated doctrine. Qui-Gon processed it through direct present-moment experience, and trusted that experience over institutional consensus when the two conflicted. He never made it to the council. He died on Naboo, his philosophy incomplete. His student Anakin passed to Obi-Wan, who was, in the Jedi framework, a more successful practitioner, more conventionally orthodox, more compliant with the Code's parameters, and entirely unequipped to give Anakin what he actually needed. The Council's clearest indicator of how it regarded living Force practitioners who prioritized present experience over long-term institutional consensus was that it never gave one a seat at the table. None of the gray synthesis figures, Jolee, Revan, Qui-Gon, articulate the argument as precisely as one woman in a game released in December 2004 that most people have never finished. Every other example illustrates the gray thesis through arc, through choices, through survival. She names it out loud. She dissects both orders with surgical specificity. Then she goes further than any of them would dare. Kreia. She appears at the beginning of Knights of the Old Republic 2, the Sith Lords, as an old woman, half-blind, stripped of Force power, unconscious in a derelict mining facility. She is the first character you interact with. The game lets you believe for a while that she's a wise elder, a mentor figure. Then it reveals she is Darth Kreia, one of 3 Sith Lords who shaped the Mandalorian War's aftermath. Then it reveals she was cast out by her own Sith apprentices, though exactly how and by whom is a question the game's dialogue leaves deliberately unresolved, and people who've spent years studying the script disagree about the mechanics. She contains contradictions. She was designed to. Her background before the fall? Kreia was a Jedi historian and teacher, a scholar of the Order's own record, responsible for transmitting its philosophy to the next generation. This context is critical. Her critique of the Jedi isn't the critique of an outsider who never understood the tradition. It's the critique of someone who knew the doctrine completely, taught it to others, watched what it produced over the full sweep of Jedi history, and eventually concluded the doctrine was wrong at its foundation. She had the receipts. She'd helped write them. When the exile asks her directly, "Kreia, what are you? Are you a Jedi? A Sith?" The answer is a philosophical prosecution. Does it matter? Of course it does. Such titles allow you to break the galaxy into light and dark. That's the critique compressed to a sentence. The binary itself is the cage. As long as every Force user must declare allegiance to one of two mutually exclusive philosophies, neither philosophy can be examined honestly, because honest examination requires distance, and the categories are designed to prevent it. You're either Jedi or you've fallen. The structure allows no position from which to evaluate the structure. Kreia had that position, and she used it methodically. Her critique of the Jedi starts with the Code's terminal destination, not its failures, but its successes. Follow, there is no emotion, there is peace, to its logical endpoint, the intended outcome. And you arrive at a Force user who has successfully detached from every person and cause in the galaxy. The Jedi would call that enlightenment. Kreia said, "Apathy is death, worse than death, because at least a rotting corpse feeds the beasts and insects." That's a logical extension, not rhetorical excess. A practitioner who has achieved the Code's stated goal, complete serenity, total detachment, has also achieved total disconnection from any motivation to act, to protect, to care for anyone. Serenity in its pure Jedi formulation is functionally indistinguishable from passivity, and passive Force users don't protect anyone. They achieve the Code's goal and thereby fail the galaxy's actual need. Kreia looked at Jedi history and identified apathy as a predictable feature of the design. The Code, if followed completely, produces a walking corpse, something that breathes and carries a lightsaber, but has carefully organized itself to feel nothing for anyone, which isn't wisdom. It's a dressed-up form of the same disconnection the Sith embodied through contempt. Her critique of the Sith is equally precise. The Sith Code ends with, "My chains are broken," and every Sith Lord who has ever lived by that code has died in chains. Because the chain is the code. The need for more power, the requirement that victory escalate, the demand that strength prove itself against the next challenge. This isn't freedom. It's servitude to appetite. A Sith whose self-worth depends on continued conquest isn't someone who has broken their chains. They have replaced one dependency with another and called the replacement liberation. Both the Jedi serenity and the Sith victory are stories the practitioners tell themselves about what their suffering means. Both stories are false. What made Kreia's teaching methodology genuinely unusual, and what makes Chris Avalone's design work on KOTOR 2 something still worth studying 20 years after the game shipped, was that she didn't just identify both failures. She structured her instruction around preventing both. She told the exile directly, "If you are to truly understand, then you will need the contrast, not adherence to a single idea." She deliberately exposed the exile to competing frameworks, contradictory evidence, multiple perspectives, not to produce confusion, but to prevent the single framework thinking that had made both orders incapable of honest self-examination. Simultaneously, she trained the exile not to rely on Force abilities, to develop the capacity to function without leaning on an external cosmic power. Her concern was Force dependency itself, the tendency of both Jedi and Sith to outsource their judgment and agency to the Force, to treat their abilities as a substitute for the harder work of developing internal wisdom. Jedi trusted the Force's will. Sith drew power from its dark currents. Both were leaning on something external, rather than becoming something internal. She would sometimes deliberately withhold Force guidance, requiring the exile to solve problems through other means, not as punishment, but as proof that the Force was a crutch, both orders had mistaken for a foundation. On her methodology. Direct action isn't always the best way. It's a far greater victory to make another see through your eyes than to close theirs forever. The Jedi closed eyes through detachment. They didn't engage deeply enough with anyone to change them, because deep engagement was attachment, and attachment was forbidden. The Sith closed eyes permanently and called it victory. Kreia's framework prioritized the harder outcome, genuine understanding, produced through contrast and experience rather than through doctrine or force, change through comprehension. It was also, not incidentally, the methodology that made her genuinely dangerous. Someone who makes you see through their eyes has done something permanent that a lightsaber can't. She isn't a saint. Her methods include deliberate manipulation, cruelty she judged instructive, and genuine violence. She killed 3 Jedi Masters in a single encounter to prevent them from interfering with the exile's development. She was, as her arc makes clear, someone who could see the failings of both orders with extraordinary precision, while remaining significantly blind to her own equivalent hubris. She saw perfectly how the institutions failed. She was considerably less accurate about herself. Her ultimate goal goes further than the gray synthesis. She wanted to destroy the Force entirely. She saw Force dependency not as something correctable through balance, but as a fundamental cosmic trap, a will that colonized every life it touched, and called that relationship the natural order. Her conclusion was that real freedom required eliminating the dependency at its source, not adjusting the philosophical framework around it. That is a distinct position from the gray thesis, and a more radical one. But her diagnosis of why both orders failed doesn't require her proposed solution. The diagnostic is separable from the cure. You can accept everything Kreia says about the Jedi suppression model and the Sith liberation model being equally false, without concluding that the Force itself needs to be destroyed. You can accept the diagnostic and look instead toward what the Jedi already knew, that balance between the aspects, held consciously, was the original answer. Avalon built in Kreia a character who functions as KOTOR 2's philosophical core, someone who has been inside both orders, been damaged by both in different ways, and emerged from both with a clarity about their failures that exceeds anything either order's defenders ever managed in their own defense. She doesn't make the simple claim that both sides are bad. She identifies the specific mechanism by which each fails. The Jedi through the productive lie that suppression produces serenity. The Sith through the productive lie that acquisition produces freedom. Both philosophies give their practitioners a story about what their suffering means. Both stories are false. The argument she makes in 2004 is still sharper than anything either order ever produced about itself. That's not a coincidence. The argument is better. Mitra Surik, the exile, deserves to be understood on her own terms, because she embodies the gray thesis at the level of lived experience rather than articulated argument. She was a Jedi general who followed Revan to the Mandalorian Wars against the Council's explicit wishes. At the Battle of Malachor V, a superweapon was triggered, and the troops under her command died in enormous numbers. She survived, but the method of her survival is the philosophically significant detail. At the moment of mass death, with Force connections severing all around her, Surik cut her own connection to the Force. She severed the link deliberately, choosing disconnection over destruction, releasing Force dependency entirely rather than channeling it through either Jedi or Sith pathways. The Jedi Council subsequently exiled her, partly for going to war against their orders, and partly because they identified her as a wound in the Force, a phrase that, in the Council's framework, was a diagnosis of damage requiring quarantine. Kreia heard the same description and responded, "You are beautiful to me, exile, a dead spot in the Force, an emptiness in which its will might be denied." The two responses to the same phenomenon contain the entire argument in miniature. The Council saw Force disconnection as pathology, something to be isolated. Kreia saw it as the first proof that independence from the Force was genuinely possible, that a sentient being could exist without being a conduit for a cosmic will, without their power being channeled through structures that came preloaded with ideological commitments. Surik hadn't chosen a side. She had stepped outside the sides entirely and survived it. Her wound also produced unexpected resilience. The Force Drain technique that Sith practitioners used to attack Jedi opponents, pulling power directly from their Force connection, weakening them through their own dependency, was largely ineffective against Surik because her connection was structured differently from the channels Drain targeted. The thing the Council identified as damage had become armor. Surviving Malachor by releasing Force dependency, which looked from outside like a failure of Force ability, produced a practitioner resistant to the specific attacks the Sith had refined for conventional Force users. She is the gray synthesis as physical fact rather than philosophical position. She didn't choose gray theory. She survived a crisis by doing what the binary had no name for, and the result was a Force user who operated outside the channels both orders had constructed, immune to some of their characteristic vulnerabilities, capable of things their frameworks couldn't account for. Put these figures in sequence, and the pattern is impossible to miss. 36,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Jedi Order on Tython built the original answer. Balance enforced by the planet itself, both aspects of the Force held simultaneously, neither suppressed. The Force Wars split them. The light side survivors founded the Jedi Order on half the original framework. 5,000 years before the Empire, Odan-Urr compressed what remained into outright suppression. For the next 5 millennia, the Jedi Order produced Anakins, people crushed under the weight of what the Code demanded and what they actually were, while the Sith produced Brotherhoods of Darkness, organizations structurally designed to collapse under their own ideological requirements. Scattered across both timelines, the same answer kept emerging from the practitioners who thought longest and suffered most. Jolee Bindo spending 20 years in Kashyyik's Shadowlands rather than submit to a council with no language for what he'd learned. Revan moving through the full arc from Jedi Orthodoxy to Sith Empire and returning with something that survived both. Qui-Gon Jinn trusting the living moment over institutional consensus, dying on Naboo before anyone listened. Mitra Surik achieving survival at Malachor through Force release when every orthodox approach would have destroyed her. Kreia naming the mechanism with enough precision that the argument holds up 20 years after the game that contained it shipped. The tragedy isn't that no one found the answer. The tragedy is that finding it disqualified you from the institutions. Jolee was marginalized. Revan was erased. Qui-Gon died before the lesson was absorbed. Surik was exiled. Kreia was cast out by every organization she'd ever joined. The Grey practitioners didn't fail to produce the synthesis. Both orders failed to survive having it produced inside them. This is where the parenthetical earns its place, even more than a Sith. The Sith fail spectacularly. They collapse loudly and visibly, the Brotherhood destroying itself at Ruusan, every Sith apprentice eventually trying to murder their master, every Sith Empire eventually tearing itself apart from the inside. This failure cycle is the Sith signature, and it's honest in a dark way. The ideology tells you what it is. It claims to liberate you through power, and then requires you to keep murdering to maintain that power. The lie is embedded in the code, available for inspection if you're willing to read it carefully. The Jedi's failure was subtler and more damaging for its subtlety. The Order genuinely believed it was offering something real. Odan-Urr revised the code because he saw practitioners getting consumed by the dark side and wanted to protect them. The Council exiled Jolee because they believed they were maintaining the Order's integrity. They accepted Anakin because they believed in his potential. They trained thousands of Jedi under a code they were convinced produced serenity, and watched them fall, and called every fall an individual failure rather than an institutional one. The feedback loop was closed by design. No council member ever looked at Anakin Skywalker and asked what the code could have done differently. Being Sith means submitting to a philosophy that will eventually try to kill you, but you know it's trying to kill you. Being Jedi means submitting to a philosophy that tells you it's working, that the emptiness you feel is actually peace, that the love you buried was a liability worth losing, that your suffering is progress toward enlightenment. Jedi practitioners got the worst deal precisely because the lie was gentler and more thorough. The Sith's trap is visible once you know what to look for. The Jedi's trap tells you you've escaped it. The Force itself, in the Legend's conception, isn't partisan. It doesn't endorse Jedi doctrine or Sith doctrine. The Jedi understood this because Tython enforced it. The planet wasn't making a philosophical argument. It was demonstrating one. Tip too far toward the light, and things collapse. Tip too far toward the dark, and things collapse. Stay centered, and things function. The answer wasn't hidden. It was legible in the planet's weather for 36,000 years before either order existed. Kreia's final position, that the Force should be destroyed, is the conclusion of someone who stared at the binary long enough to decide it was intrinsic to the Force itself, that the dependency couldn't be reformed from the inside, only eliminated. Her diagnostic of why both orders failed doesn't require that conclusion. You can accept that Jedi suppression is a lie and Sith liberation is a lie, and still conclude that the original Jedi framework was correct, that the answer isn't to destroy the machine, but to stop running it on half its fuel. The gray synthesis isn't a compromise between two valid positions held in a polite middle. It's the original position, older than either order, the one the galaxy kept being forced back toward every time a Force user thought long enough without an institution telling them to stop. Jolee Bindo protecting what he knew in 20 years of Shadowlands solitude. Revan rebuilding himself towards something that survived the full arc from Jedi to Sith and back. Mitra Surik standing at Malachor with a severed Force connection and still breathing. Kreia, in her flawed and brilliant and occasionally murderous way, naming all of it more precisely than either order ever managed about itself. Both the Jedi and the Sith failed because they were certain they were right. The Jedi